Howdy, everyone, and welcome to Moment of Truth, the podcast of American Moment. My name is Saurabh Sharma. I'm the president of American Moment, and I'm joined by
Nick Solheim, the COO of American Moment.
And we have another fantastic episode for you guys today. We're going a little bit different now. In the past, we've had on think tank presidents, we've had on scholars, we've had on friends of ours, board members, and even just recently we had on the rest of our team. We're going to foray into something a little bit different now. Today we have on Joe Kent, who's a candidate for Congress. But before we get to that, just want to bring up a couple of things that we have cooking here at American Moment. If you go to our website, americanmoment.org, you can find everything that we're up to. You can find appearances that we're doing on other shows, whether it's, I was on Steve Bannon's War Room recently, the First Things podcast, and so on. You can find information about Summit, a conference on American statecraft. You can sign up for the interest form there. We promise we have more information coming very, very soon. We're putting the final pieces in place. And you can also find AmCanon, which is our aggregator of the best books, essays, podcasts, YouTube videos, short pieces, newsletters, and more that explains how to think about the world that we do. That's constantly getting updated. Jake, our chief creative officer and the editor of AmCanon, is constantly adding new stuff there. So please make sure you check it out. Nick, is there anything else I should be paying attention to?
You should get more people to like, rate, subscribe the podcast. And seriously, send us questions that you want us to answer on air. We haven't gotten nearly as many as I thought we would. If you send us a screenshot of your 5-star review to podcast@americanmoment.org, that comes directly to me. So I will make sure that, provided it is not lewd, we will answer it on the pod. And you can also provide the question within the review itself. I'm keeping an eye on Apple Podcasts. I don't think Spotify has like a very good ratings feature. But anyway, if you have questions for us, feel free to drop them there. We'll talk about them in the intro. We didn't have any for this week.
Well, actually, we did. Someone asked a question that got asked in the guest episode itself.
Yeah.
And so by rating 5 stars, you can even help us answer or ask some questions of the guests that we have on. And boy, do we have an incredible guest for you guys today. Joe Kent is coming off of decades of truly, truly patriotic service in our military, in both, ground forces as a Green Beret, all the way through a small stint at CIA. He was slated to be part of a Trump term 2 if we had had that. But truly one of the most exciting people that is active in politics today. I know that a lot of our listeners were absolutely enthused when they heard that he would be coming on. And he's a candidate for Congress now in Washington's 3rd Congressional District. As a disclaimer, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, so we don't take any official stands on candidates or political races, but we thought that this was an informative and exciting episode. Joe talks about his experience in the military, where he thinks that American foreign policy is going awry, the political commissars that are being appointed to lead it, how we can restore manufacturing to America, and talks a little bit about service and his late wife, Shannon, as we tape today on Memorial Day. So it was an absolutely stellar episode. Nick, what'd you think?
He's just a really cool guy. It's funny, we were talking about this just before we recorded the intro, that if you Google Joe Kent, the first result that pops up is Joe Kent Superman. He does indeed look like Superman. And ladies who watch the pod, you're gonna want to turn on YouTube for this one. So yeah, it was a fantastic episode. Joe Kent's a really good guy. I think he definitely has some unique opinions about. At least unique, in Washington, D.C., about foreign policy and about, our involvement militarily abroad. He has some very important questions that need to be asked of the foreign policy and military elites here in Washington. And just all around, like, really good episode. Joe's a super good guy, and we're excited to have him on.
So make sure you stick through to the end. And now we'll go to Joe Kent. Thanks for coming on the show, Joe.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
The thing we love to do with all of our guests to begin with is have them explain how they got to the point where they are now. You're now running for Congress. How'd you end up here?
Well, it's not the typical story, I don't think. So I had pretty long career in the military, did 20 years, intended to serve another 20 or so in the CIA. So I retired on a Friday and then sworn at the CIA on a Monday, intended to make that my second career. So right after that, my late wife deployed to Syria to go fight against the caliphate. She deployed in December of 2018. Right after that, we kind of reached our military objective in Syria. We had defeated the territorial caliphate, and President Trump attempted to get our troops out. That's when the deep state essentially turned against him. Secretary of Defense Mattis, State Department officials like Brett McGurk, and a bunch of other unelected bureaucrats ran to the media, resigned publicly, and then did the slow roll at the Pentagon to keep our troops there. About a month later, tragically, my wife was killed by a suicide bomber, along with 3 other great Americans. So at that moment, I realized I had to step away from putting myself in physical danger because my wife and I have 2 small children. So I resigned from the CIA, moved back to the Northwest, to Washington State, and then from there, intended to just raise my kids and contribute as I could here and there, seeing the way that the media and then I'd say the military industrial and then like the foreign policy community really turned on President Trump and were attempting to portray it that he had somehow done this completely ignorant move by trying to get our troops out of Syria. I felt compelled to speak out because from my perspective as a guy on the ground, he had gotten it right. So I spent my entire adult life fighting in the Middle East. And I was very frustrated with the way that the DC elites felt that we just needed to be in the Middle East forever, regardless of political party. First it was Bush, then it was Obama. Trump came in and he said, hey, we are going to crush the caliphate because it's a clear and present danger, but then we're getting out. And that was the right answer based on my time on the ground. So I felt like it was my obligation to start speaking out. So I did that. I got on as many TV shows as I could, wrote op-eds here and there, and then kind of became a unconventional advisor. I had the opportunity to meet President Trump, and I told him what I just said, that he got it right, and that he wasn't going to hear it from a lot of the generals or people at the senior ranks. And because Trump was an unconventional guy, he then put me in contact with people on his staff. And I did some unofficial advising on Syria, Iraq, Iran, that portfolio. And so I was going to go back and work in a second Trump administration. But then 2020 happened, and we all saw what happened, the alliance of big tech, mainstream media, and then the ground game that the Democrats had with the mail-out votes. We saw the election pretty much get stolen from us. If we spoke out about it, we'd be labeled as terrorists or insurrectionists. So I knew I wanted to do something. I never wanted to go into politics. I never envisioned myself doing that. But I thought I was going to get active, maybe locally, be a PCO or something like that. And then my representative, who I voted for, who was supposed to be a Republican, voted for the impeachment of President Trump. And then she volunteered to be the Democrats' star witness. And so to me, that was a very clear call to action. I was like, well, I can sit here and pretty much watch the country get taken from us on every single level. And then watching what Joe Biden was intending to do with HR 1 and just radically unite the country, I just said, hey, I need to do something. And so I threw my name in the hat. I Googled, how do you run for Congress? I hit up the few people that I knew in the administration and said, hey, I'm doing this. Let me know what you think. And, if you can put me in touch with different folks here and there, that would help. But it was just kind of off the races. Did an announcement video from my little home office and then just started calling as many representatives from the local government as I could to get in front of people and let them hear my message.
So there are a lot of veterans in Congress and the administration, at the Pentagon, who have been really supportive of these endless wars over the years. Mm-hmm. What would you say is the big difference in military experience, but also opinion between you and them? How did you guys land at such different outcomes?
I think a lot of the people that are the most vocal, that we hear from the most, we hear from them for a reason, because they're saying exactly what the establishment wants them to say, Republican or Democrat. So if you want to be successful in DC and you're a military, by and large, military officer, you land somewhere at the Pentagon, you do some key command slots, but then, once you're at the Pentagon, you know that your job is to keep the machine moving forward. So if there's no will from the top levels to get us out of these wars, your job is to continue to send troops over, even if it's not effective. You just keep that big machine going. There's an incentive system outside the military for that too. With the military industrial complex, you can get put on the board of the defense contractor or something like that. And so I think a lot of it too, with my generation, with the global war on terror generation, is there's also a good deal of hubris. Like, we don't want to admit that we went over, we served, and we sacrificed, and we lost so many people for nothing. I think there is a lot of people that actually have good intentions. They just think, hey, if we just do one more year, if we just do one more combat rotation, if we just try counterinsurgency again, really, really hard, one more surge, that's the thing. Because most of these guys, I think it's pride. They have their entire professional portfolio and reputation staked on being a part of these wars. And it's really hard to say that you committed, sacrificed, and lost to something like we did in the war. It's hard to back off and be like, hey, we didn't do this right. We got it wrong. And there's political reasons behind that, you know, if you're being honest. But as a professional soldier myself, I have a really hard time with it, you know. But if we're being honest, like, what have we really gained by being in these places? So I think hearing from the guys that have been on the ground level, like I had a kind of a unique military career. I was an enlisted guy for 11 years, and the rest of it, I was a warrant officer, and that kept me on the ground level the entire time. I never was stationed at the Pentagon or any of that type of stuff. My whole career was ground truth. And when you're there on the ground, you can't make the compelling case that what we're doing is working.
People who enlisted kind of in your generation around 9/11, I can't even begin to imagine what the emotional tumult that living through that point in time, being someone who could serve, choosing to do so, and then coming to the conclusion that maybe the wars we engaged in weren't the best idea. How did you and your peers, just at a personal level, sort of think through that over the course of the 10 to 11 years that you served?
So initially, right after 9/11, I mean, emotions were hot, obviously, and we were all very grateful to be in the military. I had just gotten to Special Forces when that happened, so we knew that we were going to get to do something to strike back against what had just attacked America. So I think initially there was a lot of, I'd say, blind faith that our leaders were pointing us in the right directions. Because the military, we have the greatest military in the world, but if it's not pointed in the right direction, not given the right guidance, then it can be all for naught. And I think that's been one of the biggest lessons of the global war on terror. So I was in the Special Forces course right after 9/11. So I missed the initial push into Afghanistan, and then we were pretty much solely focused on Iraq. I went to 5th Special Forces Group, which is regionally oriented to the center of the Middle East. So Iraq became our baby for the Iraq War proper. And so initially, right after the Saddam regime fell, I think a lot of us started seeing some of the chinks in the armor of the plan, but we kind of figured that there was somebody behind the curtain at Oz, and like surely someone knew better. So, you know, initially we got rid of the Saddam regime, and we built up all these different, we demobilized a bunch of anti-Saddam militias. A lot of them were controlled by Iran because of the way that Saddam persecuted the Shias. And so a lot of that initially seemed kind of wrong to me, because it was like we knew the Iranians were bad because of Iran's history up to that point. And so we were sitting here arming these Shia militias. But that was a time when I was 23, 24, young Green Beret, and I was like, it's just my job to do what they say and to, you know, build up this militia force into an actual army. I don't know the big picture. You know, someone knows the big picture. You know, come to find out years later that nobody really knew the big picture. I think it was probably somewhere after the Iraqi elections the first time in like 05, 06, and just seeing how there was just so much sectarian hatred there for each other. And then Iran had done such a good job of fully taking over that government that I was like, this is an absolute disaster. A, we probably would have been better off just leaving Saddam in power. B, we're not gonna be able to fix this. You could send over our entire military, which at one point, at the height of the surge, we had, you know, a fair amount of soldiers over there, and it wouldn't matter. And it just became a magnet for multiple groups, from the Sunni extremists in Al-Qaeda all the way to Iran, to just sit there and pick away at the U.S. and watch us bleed.
The people who would theoretically be behind the curtain, giving the orders and helping devise the plan is essentially our sort of general class and the paramilitary class that leads at DoD. What is your assessment of the quality of our military leadership right now? Thinking back through American history, there were charismatic generals, you know, from Patton to MacArthur and so on, that really inspire American confidence in our general class. I think there's a lot of people now reevaluating that assessment. How do you think about the generals?
Yeah, I think right now a lot of them are very concerned that their generation of war, it was all for naught. And that's why I think they've resisted so heavily when we go to pull out of these places. Secretary of Defense Mattis being a great example. Like we finally had reached something that you could call a victory, the defeat of the territorial caliphate, but he desperately wanted to stay there and build the next series of bases. I mean, to what strategic end he and his ilk saw there in Syria, I'm really confused by. I don't know what you think we're going to do in, eastern Syria. But I think a lot of them are really, really holding on, trying to stay relevant. I also think that they lack the intestinal fortitude and the courage to go to our leaders and say, hey, look, there is no military solution here. Like we've seen this, we've tried this recently. Look at what we did in Afghanistan. Look what we did in Iraq. Like the task that you're giving us, if they were to say this to the president, it's just impossible via the military. The military can go break things, but as far as going in and building these countries in our image or whatever theory we're operating under at the time, it just hasn't worked. But they lack that courage because the reward system in DC is to be a good boy. I mean, whoever is in power, in authority, the better that you adhere to what they say, then the better officer you are. And that's the reward system from the time these guys come into the system, and then especially if they want to make it in the Pentagon. They don't get very far by bucking the system. There's some people that we claim buck the system here and there, like McMaster wrote a book where he trashed everybody, the leadership in Vietnam. But all those guys were retired by then, and that's about as much dissent as is tolerated from that class of generals, So I really wish there was more vocal generals speaking out right now on everything that's going on with the military. I'm sure we're going to talk about that as well, but especially when it comes to our wars. And I expect the ones that attempted to portray President Trump's policy as being naive. You could disagree with it, but saying that we are just doing the status quo is the best thing for the nation, that's where I think there's a dishonest side of their argument.
Well, it's been very weird, too, to watch this alliance between the peaceful internationalist crowd who have deep respect for the EU and for these international institutions, watching them ally with the upper echelons of our military to say, oh yeah, we're just going to continue to try to, build democracy in the Middle East. Like, surely this is what they want. And I think one of the only, hard lessons that we've learned over the last couple of years is, wow, that actually is not what they wanted. And, perhaps we have made a mistake.
Yeah, that cadre of liberal internationalists and the top brass at the military have a new charge these days, right. Which is, it seems like making sure people like you never happen again. People would call you a domestic extremist, right, I guess, right. Because you had the audacity to vote for President Trump. How are you thinking about this stuff? There's been some fantastic reporting at Revolver News from Darren Beatty about this fellow named Bishop Garrison that's at DOD. Others have dug in on it. How are you thinking about these political purges that seem like they're happening in the military?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're very alarming, and I think people need to pay a lot more attention to them. So from the time that President Biden selected Secretary of Defense Austin, they came in and said, hey, the biggest problem right now that we're facing is whatever, domestic extremism, white supremacy, something like that. Mm-hmm. And we need to do this 60-day stand down. And that stand down included the installing of political commissars, essentially. Bishop Garrison got a lot of attention, but then the first thing they did was they tried to put a guy named Estrada down at SOCOM, at Special Operations Command, my old command. And that guy didn't even bother to purge his social media. He had stuff on there where he was comparing Trump supporters to Hitler. And he's supposed to be the guy going down and making sure that we're adhering to affirmative action policies at Special Operations Command. I mean, it's hilarious, but at the same time, it's so up in your face of like, hey, if you step out of line, I am coming for you. And I think that's the message that the Biden administration is trying to send, because right now you're seeing so many active duty leaders and senior officers now on Twitter having to do all these. They're having to do their pledge of loyalty now to the new regime of woke. So if you don't virtue signal hard enough to being woke, then the spotlight could turn on you. The scrutiny could turn on you. Like, why are you not speaking the new language of the government, of the DOD? So I think it's a great way for Biden and Secretary Austin to identify who their loyalists are and who their loyalists aren't. I mean, you see this all the time in communist countries. There's a famous clip of Saddam when he purged all the military leaders. Like, he comes into this theater and he has them all there. And then the first time he reads off a guy's name and he runs off to his execution, all the different officers start standing up and they're doing their professions of love to Saddam, and that's just what it looks like to me right now. I'm being a little bit over dramatic, but seeing all these guys just say, like, the most important thing in the military right now is making sure we have an all gay helicopter crew. Put that on social media right now. And like the ponytail issue, we need to make sure that women have ponytails. Like, I don't care if women have ponytails or not, but is it that big of a deal? Do we need to make a whole like week about it like they did?
Yeah.
So to me, it's just all them saying like, I adhere to the new regime. Don't look at me. Look at the next guy who's not hot on the social media queue right now.
Yeah. So lay the groundwork. I mean, for us and our audience, what kind of deprogramming efforts are going on within the military right now? I mean, what are soldiers being taught and told to do on, the ground level to support the new regime, as you call it?
So the biggest thing is the biggest thing codified that I've seen so far, and I've had people tell me rumors here and there, but the security clearance process. To get a good job in the military, you need to be able to hold a top level security clearance. So being able to obtain one is it's necessary. We need to go through and make sure that we actually have qualified people to get security clearances. So there is a pretty in-depth process for that. Mm-hmm. But they've inserted this new clause or this new section where they want to see if you've been part of a group that believes in conspiracy theories. And so they've sent out the messaging very clear that like if you have anything on your social media, if you have expressed things publicly about the last president or a political party, the political party that's not in power, then that you might not be eligible to get a security clearance. So at that point, you're basically halting people's upward mobility. There's also a financial incentive there too to get a security clearance, because if you hold one, once you get out of the military, you're eligible to get other jobs. So they're really right now trying to enforce and make sure that people that are going to work their ways into the most sensitive locations of the federal government, they adhere to the new regime, and they will at least be cognizant enough to go through and delete all their social media and never say anything bad again. And because they know that's hanging over their head. So that's going on. And then I think just the tone set from the top down is what's really, really key, because all these subordinate leaders in the military are now going to see like, hey, we need to take a stand down day for whatever transvestite training or, racial, critical race theory and all that type of stuff. And that's going to hurt readiness because obviously the guys aren't off training. But a lot of the military, especially the guys that are on the pointy edge, they're conservative. I mean, they're probably not out there with their MAGA hats on every day, but they lean right. And so now the messaging is very much like, you guys are the enemies. And this is the same group that went off. These are my peers that went off and fought wars for the last 2 decades. And so a lot of them are just choosing to retire, get out of the military, or just, hey, I'm going to, ride this out until I've hit my 20 years and then I'm done. So it's hurting readiness, it's hurting morale, and it's just turning the military into almost what we see in like a lot of third world countries, where it's just a Praetorian Guard for the regime.
Yeah, well, and it's a joke. Like, yeah, I see people making fun of it on Twitter constantly, saying, how does this help keep America safe? Like I think a lot of our enemies are probably laughing at us that this is what we're focusing on. This is what our military leaders are choosing to talk about. So
there's been some ads that have been compared. I think people have compared the Russian military ads and the Chinese military ads with the American ones. In terms of posture, of like root cause of mission, how are you, how do you compare in your mind the way that the American military advertises itself domestically versus how other countries have been doing so over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I get it with the American military. They are trying to recruit from America. So like the recruiting messages are going to change as the culture changes. I get that. What really concerns me is the language that they're using and the image that they're projecting, because they're using language that's right out of like the critical race theory handbook. And the critical race theory handbook is all based in Marxist ideology. So especially that CIA ad where the woman is like, I can't even list it all off. She's like, I'm a cisgendered, whatever, Latina, female. Like she goes through all of her different pronouns, and that becomes the center of the advertisement of the recruiting thing. And so it shows our enemies that, hey, we've been infiltrated by this Marxist ideology, because our enemies know exactly what that is. China knows exactly what that is. So, and then the Army did the same thing where there's this, I think it's a girl and she's raised by 2 moms or whatever it is. But they put all that inclusive CRT modern local language in there. So if I'm our adversary, I'm obviously going to laugh that like, haha, I got my recruiting video is a bunch of like barrel-chested guys jumping out of airplanes and shooting guns, kind of like our ads used to be when I came in. But really, I'm going to lick my chops and think, man, we've actually gone further and done better at infiltrating this country than I thought, when I see their CIA and the military using critical theory doctrine to recruit people now. So that just says a lot about like the infiltration of our institutions and our military, but then also the general populace, that this is what young Americans want to see. It's pretty alarming.
Well, and I think too, that's why the American military, and intelligence has always been so great is because it's been a summation of, what America is. I mean, there's a reason why we call, the men and women before boomers. There's a reason why we call them the greatest generation, because they were, they were a sum of, great Americans at that time. And I think that the kind of decline in the way that we recruit people follows and I guess mirrors the decline in our culture and also our social cohesion. I mean, I've pointed this out on Twitter, but it's almost like we live in two countries right now, where this kind of thing is, praised and accepted, right? In the boardrooms of Nike and Apple and apparently the U.S. Army. And then another, part of the country where people are like, what the hell is going on? Yeah. Like, and listen, I'm 24. I have not lived a very long life, but I even remember seeing ads in 2010 that were just totally different, than what we're seeing right now. I mean, it's certainly alarming to me how quickly all of this has changed.
Infiltration takes time. Thinking back to the earliest days when you served, what are the things you can pick out now as precursors to things getting this bad? Because it didn't happen overnight. There were seeds set at some point. What were some of the more lukewarm, it's fine, whatever, things that you saw back then that you now look at and say, oh, if only we had done something then?
So I was pretty, I think, insulated in the military. I went right to Ranger Regiment, and then I went right to Special Forces. So a lot of the things I've heard other folks point out when they integrated all the MOS, all the jobs, and then don't ask, don't tell, and all that. I wasn't very affected by that personally. What I think, to kind of put my finger on a moment in time, I think is around the mid 2000s, when it was very obvious that the wars were not going very well. And maybe even, now that I think about it, to the lead up to the Iraq War, when General Shinseki said that there was no way we could actually occupy Iraq with the number of troops we had, and they fired him. So I do think that we really made this incentive system through failure, both administrations, but especially the Bush administration, and especially Iraq. There's some in Afghanistan too, but especially Iraq, because the whole thing was sold on lies. There became this desire by senior ranking officers to just echo whatever bad idea was coming out of the White House, and then to really go along. And the further that you push that bad idea, the more that you would be rewarded. So guys like Petraeus, they went and they wrote their big book on how we were going to win the war of counterinsurgency, but it fed the machine of, hey, we can't leave yet, we need to put in more troops. And so everybody that was part of his crew, they kind of got promoted along as well. And so now I think when you want to insert something as insidious as the woke doctrine, there's already been this culture that, like, hey, if you want to make it in this town, you want to make it in the Pentagon, you want to make it in the military, like, you will be the ultimate yes man, because we'll fire on the spot anybody who goes against it. So 1 minute it's surge after surge and don't give truth to power, don't actually report ground truth back to the guys in DC. And the next minute it's, hey, make the all gay helicopter crew your new priority. Don't pay attention to China on the march in the South China Sea or all the different other issues that we have.
Yeah.
So I know this is a lot to put on your shoulders, but you're running for Congress. What do we do about it? How do we fix it?
So I think we do need people that have experience in the military and people that have experience in the intelligence community to help exercise Congress's oversight role. So overall, in the global war on terror, I think Congress, regardless of who is in charge of it, has been absolutely out to lunch. The reason why these wars have gone on this long is because we've just let the president, whoever it was, operate on an authorization to use some military force. And Congress has, I think, pretty much been derelict in their constitutional duties of overseeing that. Every year they're just like, National Defense Authorization Act coming through. Like, how much money do you want? Like, can I get a couple items in there too? And like that, we just call it good. And there's very little rigorous debate on it whatsoever. So I think bringing back oversight, but then really bringing the leaders of the DoD and the intelligence community and having them explain, hey, what are you doing? Is it working? Like, really articulate it for me. Don't hide behind classification. Okay, fine, I had a security clearance. If we need to talk about something super duper secret, we can go down in the skiff, but you still have to explain it to me. I think we have a lot of people in Congress that obviously their feet aren't being held to the fire by their constituents because the wars have affected so few people. But I think some of the ones that do actually want to make a difference, I don't think that they understand really how the Pentagon and the system works. They certainly, most of them don't understand how the intelligence community works. Unfortunately, some of them that do, they're on the side of the ball that wants, never-ending interventions. So I think we need good America First guys in there that can hold their feet to the fire and say, why are we still at war? Is this terrorist group really, is the only option we have to go take out terrorism in the Middle East a conventional military occupation? Like, what is the CIA doing? Maybe they should be focused on taking out terrorists without massive ground invasions as opposed to doing what they're doing right now. I think it's the same thing too with the weaponization of the DOJ, like call them to the carpet as well.
AUMF is sort of the vehicle through which our endless wars have been propagated, is essentially the dereliction of Congress's duty there. But that doesn't necessarily get to the substance of the question of where are we right now that we shouldn't be. Your president and Department of Defense Secretary Joe Kent, where are you pulling out immediately on day one?
Oh yeah, Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq are definitely day one. I mean, for mostly the same big reason. There's some nuance in there, some details, but like our investments there there's been no return on investment. And I think all we do is make ourselves more strategically vulnerable by being there. So Afghanistan is strategic flyover country. And pretty much every country that is on the border of Afghanistan is not exactly friendly to America. So I don't know why we're hanging out there as the bad guy magnet for, places like Pakistan and Iran and then China. So that's an easy one. I just don't think there's any reason for us to be there. If Al-Qaeda does come back, I don't trust the Taliban. The Taliban, regardless of what they said in Doha, they're going to let some version of Al-Qaeda come back in there. But we do have the capability through our intelligence services. We've been there for a long time. We know a lot of people to keep our finger on the pulse and incentivize it for different tribal leaders that when their rival tribal leader hosts Al-Qaeda, there's an incentive for them to let us know about that. And then we come in very quickly and very swiftly, probably not even any boots on the ground, take care of it and get the heck out. Like no more. It doesn't matter to us if there's a centralized government in Afghanistan. It doesn't. I mean, that place has been nothing but warring tribes for its entire history. And us trying to prop up a government in Kabul makes zero sense whatsoever, Iraq is another one that is an absolute money pit that we just have to get rid of. It'd be nice because Iraq is actually in strategic territory if we had a good relationship with the Iraqi government, but that ship sailed a long time ago. Iran infiltrated the Iraqi government. They control pretty much all the key levers of that country. And so right now Iran circumvents U.S. sanctions by their dealings with the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government won't rein in their proxies who kill Americans, attack American bases. There's nothing there for us but further loss. And then Syria, like I said, the eastern deserts of Syria, there's like one oil field there. And other than that, we stand the potential of getting into a shooting war with the Russians, the Iranians, the Assad regime, every now and again, the Turks. It's like, why are we there? It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, so I want to ask you a question specifically about Syria. It seems like a lot of the pearl clutching on the right in particular about President Trump's position on pulling ground troops out of Syria was the abandonment of the Kurds. That was the big thing on the right. You had neoconservatives everywhere saying this is a human rights crisis. Like we're committing war crimes if we leave. Right. It's this horrible thing. Is that true? And if not, why?
So that's not true. So it's a complicated issue. Overall, that's not true, and we made no promises to the Kurds. As a matter of fact, we saved the Kurds. The Kurds would have been overrun by ISIS. They couldn't have held out indefinitely. So we came in there and we gave them the space to take that ground back and to hold that ground. People use the Kurds as if they are a monolithic group, and they're not. The Syrian Kurds, under Assad, they had a decent working relationship with the Assad regime. They weren't necessarily like his favorites, but at the same time, Assad wasn't doing to the Syrian Kurds what Saddam was doing to the Iraqi Kurds. Saddam was, gassing them, committing crimes against humanity. So there was a very real case to be made there. We put it in a no-fly zone after the first Gulf War that created the modern Iraqi Kurdistan. So we did save those lives with minimal boots on the ground. But Syria, we never promised them that this was going to be part of their Kurdistan. As a matter of fact, the Iraqis that we saved, the Iraqi Kurdistan, the KDP and the PUK, they supported our policy of getting out of there because those Kurds there, they fought bravely against ISIS. They deserve all the credit for that. But a lot of them have ties to sort of socialist-ish groups that operate inside Turkey. It's just a local tribal squabble that there's no reason for us to get in the middle of. So, and then, my other thing is if our bar for an intervention and constant occupation and deployment is that one group is going to do bad things to other groups, 6,000 miles away, well, then we need to start the draft, because we're going to need to be pretty much everywhere, because the world is a very dark and dangerous place outside the borders of the United States. So the neoliberals and the neoconservatives, when they say, oh, but they're all going to get killed, but little girls will never go to school again in Afghanistan, like, okay, fine, sell it to the American people that we're starting the draft, and we're going to need pretty much every man, woman, and child to go fight in, forever, because the world is horrible.
Yeah, we're going to have every man, woman, and child fight to teach critical race theory to little girls in Afghanistan.
Right.
That's going to be the...
And somehow that will make the world a better place.
Yeah.
The funny thing about the neoconservatives and the neoliberals, they never explain like what the goal is. It's always like they're the ultimate like drug dealer or card dealer at the casino. Like you're gonna win next time, man. Just don't get up. Like this, I need one more surge. We need to be in one more country, and then terrorism, it's gonna be gone. It's gonna be democracy.
Yeah, the goal is the transgender pride flag flying over Tehran. I guess zoom out for me here. Then what is the problem at a first principles level with American foreign policy over the last, I would probably argue, half century, maybe even an entire century, as Pat Buchanan, who's right there, would argue. And what should our posture, what should the use of the American military and our foreign policy be?
So I think the biggest problem is ideological interventions, where we go over and we say that we need to stop the spread of X. And if X isn't a clear and present danger to us, then I don't know exactly what we're doing over there. And if it is a clear and present danger to us, there needs to be an actual strategy for how we're going to defeat that, and then how we're going to get out. I don't think that's something that we had Vietnam, Korea, arguably as well. But then definitely the global war on terror. We morphed really, really quickly. So we went over to Afghanistan right after 9/11 for all the right reasons, to go get bin Laden and to take out the Taliban that harbored him. But right after that, when bin Laden ran over into Pakistan and we got told, hey, you can't pursue him into Pakistan, we switched. I mean, Bush said it was like April of 2002 that he wanted to do a nation building mission. And then the next thing you know, we're invading Iraq. So when we go into these places for these lofty ideals, I think that's where things just go completely off the track. So we really have to look at, hey, if we're going to deploy our military, and I'm not against military deployments, I'm against continual wars. I mean, we do need to project power in some cases. Every now and again we need to flex somewhere, and that's fine. That's part of the balance of power that we need to play. But if it comes to actual boots on the ground, we're going to be in combat. There has to be clear-cut present danger, and then how we're going to get out of there. And then U.S. foreign policy is, at the end of the day, we're not the world's police. We're not out here to give the entire world life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We're here to make sure that our people have that. So securing our borders, I think, is a military objective. But then also, we don't need to go overseas just looking for trouble. I think that's key.
On Twitter, we mentioned that you'd be coming on the podcast, and we solicited questions that people may have for you. And I think one of them is apropos here. Someone asked, I believe the account is Alexei Aurora. He asked, how do we prevent this new phase of engagement with China that we're starting to evaluate in the United States from becoming a cause for a second Cold War, essentially? How do you think about the China issue? Where do you think that the neocons may be infiltrating the question? How are you thinking about China?
I think China, they're already in an economic, cultural, and information war with us, and we just have not been participating. We've been infiltrated, essentially, at pretty much every level. I read that book by Josh Rogan, Chaos Under Heaven, and that book, like every chapter, you're just like, he talks about another level of society in which the Chinese have their fingers in. For me, as a guy who was fighting in the global war on terror, it's painful that we let China get this powerful and pose this much of a threat while we are bleeding in other places. I'd love it if I could say, hey, at the end of the day, the times I served, the friends that I lost, like it was going towards this great thing that we actually defeated and we beat, kind of like our grandfathers did in World War II. But with China, it's all economic. We have absolutely killed off our ability in this country to produce. So our whole modern monetary theory right now of like, let's just continue to print money and keep a certain segment of our society out of work, that plays right into China's hands. If you're a power and you've gobbled up most of the world's production ability, man, you are working from a position of strength there. If you look at the way that we took out the Soviets in our Cold Wars, because our economy just absolutely drained them, So I think restoring production is 100% key. Getting all of our manufacturing lines out of China has to be absolutely essential. And then going after them for everything, intellectual property theft, offensively using tariffs. Like, we have to start fighting the war back against them. So I do think we're engaged in some sort of a war. I don't know if you can avoid it. I mean, if we try and put our heads in the sand and say, we don't really want any trouble here and there, China's going to be like, oh, great. I mean, because they're killers. I mean, and they have complete and total control of their government. Like, their government's all inclusive. And I think we need to get more aggressive about that, aggressively defending our country. And that starts with strengthening our economy and making our economy independent.
The first domino that seems like it could fall on the question of a military conflict is Taiwan.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about the risks there, what the United States' involvement should be, and so on?
So the biggest risk, I mean, is really Taiwan has their sovereignty, and we should help them with that. Again, I'm apprehensive about going to war, a kinetic war over somebody else's soil. What we need to do is we need to get most of the chip production out of there. So the microchips and then all the different technology manufacturing that happens in Taiwan. That's why Taiwan is so darn important. So if we were to pull a lot of that out and get that back into America, we take away a lot of Taiwan's value to begin with, and we strengthen our economy in the process. So that's the game. I would like to pull out the rug from underneath the Chinese in that sense. But then also getting our Navy more active in the South China Sea. I mean, that's a good deterrence use for a conventional military, but that's mostly for show. I don't think that that's going to be the end all be all that we go over and we flex hard on China. I think taking away what's valuable from Taiwan makes Taiwan less valuable to the Chinese. So therefore, why are they going to send their Navy down there and play some sort of a risky move against us?
Yeah. So how exactly do you view that economic part working? I mean, are you thinking, we just tell Intel, hey, you make these here now. It's no discussion. Like, yes, fine, my iPhone costs $2,000 now, whatever.
Yeah.
Just do it here. Or do you think, maybe there's some, tax incentive or something for new companies to do so?
Yeah, I think that's key. I wish there was like a simple flip switch you could just go flip over at Congress or the DoD and just be like, hey, it's done, it's back here now. But we have to really incentivize those companies to move back here. And I think we can. I mean, the reason why those companies moved over there in the first place was the regulations that we put on companies. We make it very difficult to actually have your production base here in the United States. So getting rid of those regulations, I think, is absolutely key. And then possibly even, massive tax breaks if they do it quickly. And then with that carrot, there needs to come a stick of like, hey, at some point we are going to tariff you like we tariff a foreign company. That's just it. And maybe the iPhone prices go up, but then we have competition in the U.S. market that I think could balance that out. It's a risky thing. It's not 100%, but at the same time, the way that China, the grasp they have right now on our economy and especially on world manufacturing production, I think is something that we need to take as seriously as we would take a war.
Yeah, well, that's the thing that I never understand is you see all these people on Twitter saying, oh, well, if you do that, you can't buy a flat screen TV for $150. And it's like, which would you rather have, a $150 flat screen or be able to actually make things in your country and give good jobs to good people,
so Yes, we'd have to make I think that would initially be the case. That would be like the market reaction of like, oh crap, we can't make these over here. But if we start incentivizing all these companies with tax breaks, I think, competition would just take care of that. We're not going to just we have to import them now for $150 or this one U.S. manufacturing company can only make an iPhone for $2,000. I think the market would eventually correct itself.
I agree.
This town is full of, frankly, silly and possibly seditious people who would call what you just said socialism. They would say that, you can't have things made in America. That's socialism. Again, they should be chased out, tarred and feathered.
Seditious people.
Yeah. What is your broader approach to economics? How do you think of what the American government at the federal level, their role should be in our economic policy? What do you think the squeaky wheels are in our economic policy? The Republican Party's answer for the last 30 years has been tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. There's not many taxes left to cut, so we have to do something else. What is it that you want the federal government to be doing to improve the state of the American economy?
So I look at it as not really messing with things inside, but then making things come back to us and messing with things that want to come from the outside. So we have to get production back up. Like my district, we're in the heart of timber country, and our timber industry, which employed a lot of people and made it possible for people to graduate high school, get a job in a mill, get a job working in the logging industry, and support a family. It made that very possible for generations. Federal government came, seized up a bunch of the land. A ton of our land is owned by the federal government, and then they heavily regulated it through the EPA and a couple other useless government organizations. And now we literally are sitting on these forests that, yeah, some of them we can use for recreational use, but with logging at its peak, we could still use them for recreational uses too. There's a ton of land out there, but right now we've just absolutely killed off that industry. The forests aren't maintained, so we have horrific wildfires every year. But we need to bring back manufacturing in this country. Like, there's no way we can continue to run on this deficit economy. We're not producing anything, and now that we're not producing anything, why would we expect all these other countries, China being one of them, to buy our debt bonds continually? That just seems like a massive vulnerability to me. So I use the timber industry as an example because it's from my district, but the energy industry, massive coal, steel, all that. We need to get back into aggressively bringing back U.S. production, and that's going to take care of a ton of the angst and the carnage, for lack of a better term, that's been inflicted on the working class and the middle class now for generations. Same thing with the tech industry. I mean, all these kids, my generation and younger, we were told, hey, like, you can't have an industry job anymore. It's blue collar, it's dirty, it's old fashioned, and it's done. What you need to do is you need to go to college, and like you need to
learn to code.
You got to, essentially, yeah, you need to learn to code, or like, I mean, there's even it's a very boomer kind of mentality. Like, just get a college degree in anything. It doesn't matter what it is. And so a lot of people, like, they fell into that, and they went and they got a degree, some useful, some not. Then they had to move out of their small town because their small town was killed off because there's no more industry there anymore. They get to a big city. Where's I have a bunch of student debt. Now, where's the job? Well, the job has been taken away and outsourced by H-1B, L-1 visas on the tech side. And then also now we just have this gig economy. So we have these people that are, they're saddled with all kinds of student debt. They can't get a good job. They can't start families. We've made a generation into Russian serfs. So I think a big thing is just getting that production economy back on that. And I do think the federal government has a role to play because, like I said before, it's a national security issue. We need to treat it like it's a wartime thing. So like, we aggressively need to get all these towns back online that have been absolutely just decimated. So I think when some of these companies come back from overseas, if the government's going to cut a good deal, a good tax incentive, we can tell those companies where to relocate and revive these industries. So that's my economic philosophy, is getting our production back on, and our working class and our middle class back to work.
Yeah, one of our fellows' families used to own a, you know who I'm talking about, used to own a like a sawmill in West Virginia. And I remember specifically in his interview when we were kind of talking about, basically asking the same question that Saurabh just asked you. He said, yeah, when I was growing up, NAFTA was always a dirty word in my household. Like, that was a bad word that we were not allowed to say. And I think that accurately reflects the feelings of most people who have been doing, hard blue collar work for years and are suddenly told that they're not able or allowed to do so.
Right.
What's the American dream in your view? Like, what is the signpost and the telos that we should be pursuing for every American family? Like, what's that life supposed to look like for the broad middle of the country? Paint a word picture for me on this.
I think it's being able to essentially graduate high school. You can go to a good public school that's going to teach you good educational skills, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but then also good patriotic U.S. history. And then at the end of that, if you're willing to go and work hard, there's multiple industry jobs waiting for you. It's geographically going to vary based on where you live in the country, but there needs to be a thriving economy where a young man or a young woman can go get a job, and then a couple of years later they can get married and one spouse can stay home, and you don't need to have two incomes, and you don't need to have these be saddled with the position that many young couples are in. It's like, well, can we afford to now get a babysitter? Childcare is a huge issue. We have to get back to being able to have someone work an honest day's work, and that pays for their family and a modest house, and then just a responsible, good middle class type of life with a pension program built into your company. I think that's really what that system right there got our country back online after the Depression and after World War II.
Last summer, American cities burned. And you were right there in the middle of it, right around the Portland area. Walk us through what you saw and why it motivated you in part to run for Congress.
Yeah, what I saw in my hometown of Portland, actually pretty scary to see in the States. I saw what I had seen overseas, especially after the regime of Saddam fell and there was violence brewing up and boiling beneath the surface. There was, different groups over there that they hated each other and they were just waiting for someone to give them some purpose and direction, which is what a lot of the really bad actors did, Al-Qaeda being one of them. So this last summer in Portland, when after the George Floyd incident happened and BLM initially started doing some of their peaceful protests, Antifa and then bad actors from BLM jumped right in there and they provided the violence and they provided the direction to that. And then right away I saw that was obviously bad, but you could put your finger on it because it's people acting violently. What I saw from people who I knew, who I grew up with, and the broader community in Portland was support, ideological support for what was going on. And because they had been so indoctrinated with critical theory, 1619 Project, all this, that like right when Antifa and BLM could say, this right here is the example of what we've been teaching you guys about, and we have to go over and overthrow it. People's minds were immediately changed, and they were like, well, it's okay that Antifa and BLM are burning down our city every night, and every now and again they march into the suburbs and smash up cars and scream at people and tell them to stay in their houses or get out of their houses. They were justifying that to themselves. They were spending their money to support Kamala Harris's favorite charity of bailing out rioters. So seeing that, it was really alarming. And then that violence just never went away, because violence does never go away on its own. That's the thing. If violence isn't checked, it's just human nature. Like, violent actors don't go out and wreak havoc and then just decide that like, oh, on the 15th of the month, we'll stop wreaking havoc. It doesn't work that way. They have to be dealt with force. And that just never happened in Portland. And so now it's expanded. The homeless population, they're not really homeless. There's a ton of folks that moved in there essentially as a proxy army that live in these different homeless camps. And anytime I think the far left wants to turn on the violence, they mobilize these guys. And they've even been an expeditionary force. They've gone to different U.S. cities, Michigan, Minnesota, and all that. So, I mean, it's been insane to see here in the States, and it's been horrible to watch leaders who've been charged with providing law and order and a peaceful community for their citizens just completely neglect their duties.
I have a buddy in Minnesota that says the Black Lives Matter sign on the front lawn is the modern day blood of the lamb over the door that says to pass over this house.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's more of a fear-based thing than anything else.
Yeah, it's the don't hurt me sign.
Yeah. You know who that was.
Yeah, I do. What would you have done at that point during the summer if you were, directly advising President Trump at that moment in time? What would you have asked him to do? And what do you think the long-term response to avoid this sort of stuff happening again at the legislative level needs to be?
I think we need to designate Antifa and BLM as terrorist organizations and then start arresting and slapping those bad actors with terror charges, with federal terrorism charges. Because like the local governments, they've said they won't do it. There's a part of me, the conservative part of me is like, well, they voted for it, so let their cities burn. But the problem is, once again, it spills over. So my district, we are essentially a suburb of Portland, and not too far to our north is Seattle. So we're really sandwiched in between it. We've seen the spillover into our district. So these things have consequences. So this is where we do need the federal government to come in, federal law enforcement to come in. We have the tools. Like the Portland police, they know who all these guys are. If you went and talked to a beat cop who worked last summer, he knows exactly who all the rioters are. He knows who the leaders are. He's probably arrested them all multiple times. We just have an activist district attorney there who refuses to slap them with charges, and a very cowardice mayor who refuses to deal with it. So that's where I think the federal government needs to come in. Target them like we target terrorists, target them like we target organized crime, because they're crossing state lines. You could easily use like a lot of the RICO tools to go after their financing. And then I think that needs to be exposed to the American people, who's funding these guys, how they work, how they organize. So I think that's part and parcel and key. And then when we go for federal law enforcement grants, like mayors and police departments that refuse to actually support law and order, they should not get one dime. And then I would squeeze the mayors and the leadership as hard as I could of those cities and just stop funding them. Like, they get zero federal funds anymore. Like, until they start cooperating with the FBI and they start cooperating with the marshals to clean this problem up, like, they get nothing, like any federal fund. I don't care what it is. Like, I think if we did that, that would change behaviors really fast.
Yeah, in some ways, it's an extension of the sanctuary city policy that we pursued for the past couple of years. Yeah. So we've talked about, endless wars. We've talked about crime. We've talked about your economic worldview. What are some of the other issues that you see yourself leading on were you to get elected to Congress, the issues you really care about that you think aren't getting the attention they deserve in Washington?
Election integrity. So the election of 2020 is something that we cannot listen to the mainstream media on and be shy about, or even a lot of traditional Republicans who are just like, well, Biden's the president and boy, 2020, we just need to vote harder next time, because we lost legitimately. Like, we know that's not true. There's widespread discrepancies wherever you fall on the spectrum of thinking that it was absolutely stolen, or you think, I don't know, there were some things that were fishy. We can't move on as a country until we adjudicate the election of 2020. And that's what got me into this race. But then also when I go throughout my district, from like my urban hub and talk to business guys all the way out talking to loggers, the first thing they say to me is, what are we going to do about our elections? What happened in 2020, and are we going to let them get away with it? Because there's a large portion of the population right now who's disenfranchised of voting. And voting it's the social contract we have with our government. Like, and if we violate that and we don't have that anymore, or there's a large part of the population that believes that that the contract has been violated, they're going to turn to other means to express their grievances. And I've been all over the world and been to places where people express their grievances, not at the ballot box, and it's ugly. And I don't want to see that in America. So I think we need to have a full congressional inquiry. That's what I want to do when I get into Congress. Full congressional inquiry. We lay out all the evidence. We subpoena witnesses, subpoena evidence, put people under oath, and just fully adjudicate it. I think a lot of it's happening starting right now down in Arizona, Georgia, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I think a ton of that's going to start happening, but we really need to paint that picture, I think, for the American people, just to show them that, hey, we're not moving on. Because at the end of the day, it's not about Trump. It's not about, did my guy win? Is our process legit? Is it what it says that it is?
Yeah. So what are those reforms that need to happen in order to ensure that what happened in 2020 with our election doesn't happen again?
Yeah, we need to absolutely pass a voter ID law, and then in-person voting, I think, needs to be the absolute norm. I mean, there's some cases where absentee ballots are required, people that are indefinitely confined, military votes, whatnot. I think a notary system would help out a lot with that. And then getting the machines out of the process, 100%. You have to vote at your precinct. Your precinct rosters are scrubbed every year, and then your votes are tabulated by people counting them by hand, real election observers from both parties that can watch. Maybe it takes a little bit longer. Like, who cares? That's fine. It doesn't need to happen right away. Like, I think that those are the core things that we need to change. Problem is that needs to happen at the state level. There's only so much that the federal government can do in that regards. I'm against federalizing the elections. That's what the Democrats want to do with HR 1, So I think that the congressional inquiry would lay it out so that the American people would then demand it at their state legislatures and with their governors. So I think that's kind of the first step to getting a fair and free elections.
Yeah. We're recording this on Memorial Day. You just did a War Room with Steve Bannon earlier today. I want to ask you what service means to you. You served our country in the military for over a decade, and now you're posturing yourself for a different form of service in American life. I mean, how do you think about your obligation to the country, and what is it that really motivates you there?
So it's always been what I consider to be my calling. I mean, even before I went overseas and was in the military, from the time I was a really young kid, I was just amazed that there was people that went overseas to fight so we could enjoy freedom back here. And then that's why I joined the military, and that's why I stayed in for 20 plus years. So to me, it was always about trying to give back, because this country, by virtue of just being born here, regardless of your circumstance, I'm very blessed, great family, was given a great environment to grow up in, but just by virtue of being born in the United States, you are so far ahead of the power curve, and by any standards, this country gives all of us so much. So to me, it's a debt that we can never really fully pay. So to me, I always have to be doing something to move our country forward and to protect our country and to protect our way of life. So service to me is just, you constantly have to be giving back. It's never done. I don't think there's ever a time where you can just look back and say, well, this one time I did this one thing, and now I'm just going to sit back and only worry about me. Because if we do that and we fall for that trap of comfort, then our country is going to be outran by people that have the worst intent. And I think we're seeing that right now. I think there's a lot of people that have been admirably serving the country for the last 2 decades. And then there's been a lot of other people who've been very comfortable. I think the boomer generation got very comfortable. Vietnam scarred them a little bit. And I think there was a negative connotation behind serving. And people thought it was much more admirable to just worry about themselves. And then we built this very selfish culture that right now is kind of coming to a head. And we're very vulnerable to all these different divisive theories, and then also to, different countries that have worked their way into our system. So service to me it's just never fully paid. You have to continue to give and push forward.
I mean, your family has in some ways epitomized the most extreme version of what service looks like, including giving your life for this country. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your late wife, Shannon Kent, and sort of how she factors into the way that you think about the questions of service and leadership.
Yeah, so Shannon has a great American story. I mean, she was in college. She had just started her sophomore year of college when 9/11 happened. And her uncle and her father were both first responders. Her father was a New York State trooper, and then her uncle's a Staten Island firefighter. So they responded to Ground Zero. And then Shannon and her brother, who's a year younger than her, went and found military recruiters. And Shannon knew that she could learn languages fairly easily. She had self-taught Spanish and French. So she said to the recruiter, "Hey, I can learn Arabic, like put me in." And from there, she was kind of off to the races. She multiple combat tours as an Arabic linguist. She learned how to be a cryptologist, so stealing signals. And then she got into human intelligence collection, so running informants in their native language. So she gained a very specific skill set that put her on the forefront with special operations. So she was doing that, pushing forward for our country, even before it was codified that women could serve, in combat and in special operations. So she just always exemplified to me someone who always said, "Send me." Like, if someone has to go into harm's way, send me. And she always knew exactly how to best ply her skills and ply her trade. So she knew that she had a knack for languages, and she could have done a million other things. And so, but she was like, "Hey, our country right now, we need to figure out what these people in this very difficult to learn language are saying. So I will be the one that goes and does that." And it's a very glamorous job, being a linguist and being an intelligence collector. If done right, no one knows your name until tragically you're killed, like my wife. So I like telling her story, and her example really, pushes me and drives me forward. And then the timing and the nature that she was killed in Syria after Trump tried to get our troops out, to me, that's really what's pushing me forward right now, because Shannon's death to me represents so much. It really represents how much damage that the ruling class has inflicted on this country, because the same people that had no issues with disobeying a duly elected president and leaving our troops in harm's way, these are the same guys that have had no issues keeping us at war, doubling down on failed policy after failed policy. It's the same elites that had no issues shipping all of our manufacturing overseas, that at the end of 2 decades of bleeding in the Middle East, the only thing we have to show for it is that China could eat our lunch and stop buying our debt bonds. So to me, her death has propelled me forward into this next level of service, because I really want to go after all the damage that the permanent ruling class has done to this country and put us back on a trajectory where we can go forward as a nation and really just take care of ourselves and make sure that the American people can pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without being absolutely weighed down by the agendas of the permanent ruling class.
Doesn't sound like you're the best fit for DC if that's what you care about. Joe, where can people learn more about you?
I can go to joekentforcongress.com. So I have all my stances to the issues on there. There's a link tree to all the social media. And if they can, I'd really appreciate a donation. I'm up against Jamie Herrera Butler, who is sitting on Republican establishment money. The Lincoln Project's juicing a bunch of cash into her. And then after that, I'll be up against an absolute crazy leftist from the Democrats. So I put $200,000 of my own money into the campaign because I hate asking people for money. So I want to lead by example. I mean, just like the Founding Fathers said, we pledge our lives and our sacred fortunes to this endeavor. And that's what I want to do too. So my money's on the table. And then if anybody can kick me a donation to help me fight back against the establishment, I'd really appreciate it.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. And
thank you.
This day and every day, thank you for your service to our country.
Thanks very much.
After our episode this week, we wanted to talk a little bit about something that we have on AmCanon that Jake, our chief creative officer and the editor of AmCanon, has lovingly put together. And that was one of our features. Now these features are in some ways kind of a recombinant version of stuff that we're doing in general on AmCanon, where we're assembling sort of the best, most influential stuff that we care about, whether it's a book, an essay, a podcast, a YouTube video, and so on. But these features focus on sort of one topic, and they sort of go from basics down to more advanced levels and different subdomains within a given topic. We've done ones on families, we've done one on big tech, we've done one on personnel as policy, and we have one that recently came out called A New Grand Strategy for America. Capping it off is the episode that we did with John Allen Gay of the John Quincy Adams Society, where we did a broad overview of the different issue areas, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, theoretical concepts, history, and so on. But if you want to learn more about foreign policy, if hearing Joe talk about how we need to end our endless wars was inspiring to you, please go to americanmoment.org/amcanon, AMCANON, and pull up this feature, because in it, we really delve deep into how to think about this, not just to yell about how ending endless wars is important on the Twitter machine, although that is important. Make fun of neocons, we encourage it. But it's also important to be well informed, and this is an issue where the establishment loves to leverage the fact that their expertise, which is in some ways their undoing, disqualifies you from talking about it. And so if you are a young person who wants to get involved in the foreign policy space, it is your moral duty and responsibility to make sure you know your stuff. You need to be able to talk like Joe did or John Allen Gay does about foreign policy, because if we don't, we'll always be on the losing end when it comes to applying the instincts that we believe in on foreign policy.
Yeah, it's, Jake puts a lot of effort into these features. This is, what number is this? Number 5.
Yeah.
So this is the 5th one. Highly recommend you check it out. I'm sure Jake will probably add this interview with Joe Kent to a future foreign policy feature at some point. But highly recommend that you check that out.
Yeah, and in general, just keep an eye on AmCanon. A lot of you are staffers on Capitol Hill, you're at public policy organizations, your job keeps you busy every day, and so you don't have time to necessarily be in the weeds, going to every magazine or web publications page and seeing what the newest best stuff is. That's why we're doing this, because this will help you understand. And also, I hear this all the time, kind of a broad view on this. Every organization is an assemblage of the private obsessions of its founders. That there is no exception when it comes to American Moment. And part of the reason we created AmCanon, because constantly over the past couple of years, people have come to me and they've been like, what do I read and watch to understand, this nationalism, this populism stuff that you're always talking about? And eventually got to the point that I was sick of pulling 20 different links together in my notes app and sending it over. Now I can just point them to an easy URL that I can type out. And so if you have someone that that is grasping in this direction on how to think about politics of restraint and realism on foreign policy, of sanity and immigration, of supporting families and so on, send them to AmCanon. They'll find winsome, compelling arguments for these in order to bring them along. And then on your side of things, you'll find pieces that help you understand the vocabulary and how to think about it as well. So always going to make a plug for this at the end of our episodes, because this podcast is in some ways a tool to fill whatever small gaps we do see in that canon. There's lots of good stuff out there, and that's why we do this every week.
But with that, let's dive into the feature itself.
Yeah, we divide it into a couple different sections. There's one on sort of getting started, broad theoretical conceptions on foreign policy that are really important. And then, from the archives, we pull out some speeches and other things from everyone from John Quincy Adams to others on how to think about foreign policy, how our founders envisioned foreign policy. We talk about sort of the contemporary liberal order and how it leads itself to a liberal internationalist framework. And then we do deep dives on different regions of the world, how to think about China, how to think about Russia, how to think about the Middle East, and so on. And each of those requires a different approach. And it's especially important, I think, on the China issue to be extraordinarily vigilant right now. The neoconservatives in Washington have decided that they are going to, quote unquote, pivot to China. They're going to use China as the vehicle to keep the gravy train with the military-industrial complex running for the next 100 years. And it's our moral responsibility to prevent them from doing that and to ensure we have the right frame on the China issue.
Yeah, I mean, The China issue is twofold. I always get into a lot of trouble on Twitter whenever I talk about this. I remember a particular spicy tweet of mine over the holidays where I had tweeted that I wish that the China issue could be framed by the Republican Party in any other way except for like being about the Uyghurs
and the Hong Kongers.
Yeah, like it's like that's what it's always about, and that's where I think you see the neoconservatives starting to kind of like weave their way in, like, oh yes, we can be a part of this China thing too, by making it about all of this kind of international outcry over human rights issues or whatever. And like Joe said today, if that's what we want our U.S. military to do, everyone better join up, grab their weapons. We're going to liberate everyone, everywhere.
Yeah, and look, this is the hard-nosed realist approach that's necessary if we're going to have sanity in our foreign policy. I use this line at least like 2 times a week from a former guest on our podcast, Micah Metacroft. He has a piece called China and Civic Piety that you can find on AmCanon, in fact. And in it, I believe that the money line, as it were, is America owes a strategic counter to China, not to Uyghurs and Hong Kongers, but to the American people. It's as simple as that. Deindustrializing the Midwest and consigning generations of Americans to poverty and destitution unless they're willing to uproot their entire lives and move to some liberal hellhole of a city is the primary thing that I worry about when it comes to China. And frankly, it should be what our ruling class worries about too.
Well, generally, it's a bad sign when the women who wear like I'm Speaking Kamala shirts and like vagina hats and like they just are really passionate about the European Economic Area are teaming up with generals of the U.S. military to push some kind of foreign policy initiative. Like that generally seems to me to be a sign that what they're advocating for is a bad idea.
Yeah.
You never want to see those two together.
It's funny. I was Twitter DMing with a more libertarian leaning foreign policy realist the other day. And I said that, the libertarians, they tend to be a little bit weaker on the social issues. They don't care about them as much. But I said the issue of realism and restraint is more likely to gain market share on the right now than it ever has before, precisely because the military has become entirely co-opted as another tool of liberal hegemony. The telos of the American military at this point, becoming more and more, it appears, to make sure that a pride flag is flying over Tehran is only a good thing if you want the Republican Party to be the force in American politics fighting for realism and restraint, because now it's a cultural issue. And people who are very skittish about the culture war get very upset with me when I say this, but I think it's so important that we frame the military in a right way, that we thank military veterans for their service and their sacrifice. And that's what we closed out the podcast with Joe, thanking him for. We're thankful today, especially on Memorial Day, but every day. But it's important to realize that the ruling class of the military is not the rank and file of the people who sacrifice every day. And they are utilizing the greatest force on earth as a tool to implement liberal cultural priorities.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like a 3-sided Venn diagram. On the top you have, like military contractors, the military industrial complex. Over here, you have people who just really love the UN and like that's their thing. And then you have the weird European trained people. And they're like, their space in the middle is, oh yes, we should go to war with China over Taiwan, and we should stay in the Middle East forever. And, also we should be teaching critical race theory to new soldiers. And it's just, it's unacceptable. We shouldn't accept it. It's evil. It runs contrary to all of the ideas that make up America, and we shouldn't stand for it.
That's right. Liberal empire is bad. You can learn more about it on AmCanon. Make sure to rate and subscribe. Ask questions. We want to answer your questions. Grill us if you think that we're wrong about something. We are more than happy to be contested with. And with that, we will see you guys next week. Thank you again, as always, for listening, and have a great week. Moment of Truth is an American Moment Studios production filmed at the Conservative Partnership Center. Our podcast is produced and edited by Jake Mercier and Jared Cummings. Our intro music is A Minor Struggle by Ryan Serenich. Don't forget to like and subscribe on all platforms, and you can go to AmericanMoment.org to learn more.